The flames had already consumed everything by the time Faith Owens realized she was alone in this world, standing in the ashes of what used to be her family's ranch with nothing but the nightgown on her back and the bitter taste of smoke in her mouth. She had been visiting her sister in San Antonio that September morning of 1878 when the telegram arrived, terse and devastating. Ranch burned, parents gone, brother missing. The journey back to Bandera, Texas, had been a blur of rattling stagecoach wheels and mounting dread, but nothing prepared her for the sight that greeted her. The main house was a blackened skeleton against the pale sky, the barn reduced to charred timber, and the livestock either dead or scattered across the hill country. The marshal had met her at the edge of the property with his hat in his hands and sympathy in his eyes, explaining what little he knew. A kitchen fire in the night spread too fast, her parents overcome by smoke before they could escape. Her younger brother Thomas had been in town that night, thank God, but he had taken off the moment he heard, unable to face it. Nobody had seen him since. Faith had stood there for 3 days, sleeping in what remained of the bunkhouse, sifting through debris for anything salvageable. She found her mother's silver locket, warped by heat. Her father's Bible, the edges burned away. A tin of buttons. Nothing else survived. The neighbors came with casseroles and condolences, but their eyes held something else to calculation. The Owens ranch sat on prime grazing land with a good water source, and Faith was 22 years old, unmarried and now utterly alone. Within a week, 3 different ranchers had approached her with offers to buy the land for a fraction of its worth. When she refused, they smiled thinly and told her she would change her mind soon enough. A woman could not run a ranch alone. By the second week, Faith had sold what remained of the livestock to pay for her parents' burial and the outstanding debts she discovered in her father's papers. By the third week, she was living in town in a boarding house room barely large enough to turn around in, taking in mending and washing to pay her rent. By the fourth week, she had stopped going to church. She had been raised with faith as solid as bedrock, taught that God had a plan, that prayer could move mountains, that righteousness would be rewarded. But standing in that burned-out shell of her childhood home, Faith had felt something crack open inside her chest, something cold and hollow rushing in to fill the space where certainty used to live. What kind of God took good people like her parents, hardworking and kind, and left their daughter with nothing? What kind of divine plan included a young man like Thomas, barely 19, running off into the wilderness in his grief? She had prayed every night of her life, and for what? Ashes and silence. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Garrett who asked too many questions and had opinions about everything. Faith kept to herself, taking the back stairs to avoid conversation, eating her meals alone in her room. The other residents were mostly traveling salesmen and an elderly couple who argued through the thin walls every night. Faith lay in her narrow bed and listened to their bickering, to the creaking floorboards, to the sound of her own breathing, and felt the weight of loneliness pressing down on her chest like something physical. She had been in town for 6 weeks when Kade Brennan rode in on a dusty buckskin horse, his saddlebags worn thin and his boots scuffed from hard miles. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water in summer, that pale green-brown that seemed to change with the light. He took a room at the boarding house for a week, paying in advance with coins he counted out carefully, and Faith noticed him the way she noticed everything these days, with a kind of distant, detached observation, as if she were watching life through a window instead of living it. Kade worked odd jobs around town, fixing fences and breaking horses, doing the kind of hard labor that left a man bone tired at the end of the day. Faith saw him in the mornings when she carried her basket of mending down to the porch where the light was better, and he would tip his hat to her as he passed, a gesture so simple and unremarkable that she almost did not notice when it started to feel like the only kindness in her day. It was a Thursday afternoon, unseasonably hot for October, when Faith's carefully constructed solitude finally shattered. She had been walking back from delivering a stack of mended shirts to the general store, her payment jingling in her pocket, barely enough to cover another week's rent, when she saw Thomas's horse tied outside the saloon. She knew that paint mare anywhere, the white blaze down her face distinctive as a signature. Faith's heart lurched in her chest, hope and relief flooding through her so suddenly she felt dizzy. She hitched up her skirts and ran across the dusty street, not caring about the look she got, pushing through the saloon doors into the dim, smoke-filled interior. Thomas was at the bar, but he was not the boy who had left 6 weeks ago. He was thinner, harder, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking as he reached for the whiskey glass in front of him. When Faith called his name, he turned slowly, and she saw that he was not alone. 2 men flanked him, rough-looking characters with guns on their hips and the kind of watchful stillness that spoke of violence held barely in check. "Thomas, thank God," Faith said, moving toward him. "I have been so worried. Come home, please. We can figure this out together." But Thomas did not move toward her. He looked at her with something like anguish, his young face twisted with emotions she could not read. "There is no home, Faith. It is gone, all of it." "We can rebuild," she said, her voice breaking. "The land is still there. We can start over." One of the men beside Thomas laughed, a harsh sound. "Lady, your brother owes us $200. He ain't going anywhere until we get our money." Faith's blood went cold. What is he talking about? Thomas would not meet her eyes. "I got into some trouble, a poker game. I thought I could win it back, but—" $200. Faith's voice came out as a whisper. It might as well have been 2,000. She had maybe $7 to her name. "Thomas, how could you? We've been real patient," the second man said. He was older, with a scar running down one cheek. "But patience runs out. Your brother here has until tomorrow sundown to come up with the cash, or we start taking payment other ways." His eyes raked over Faith in a way that made her skin crawl, and she understood the implication. She grabbed Thomas's arm. "You are coming with me right now." But the first man stepped between them, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "I don't think so. See, Thomas here has become our insurance. You want to help your brother, little lady, you find us that money. Otherwise, well, we might have to go visit that nice plot of land you still got out by Cypress Creek. Heard it would sell for a good price to the right buyer." Faith felt the room spinning. This could not be happening. She had already lost everything. She could not lose Thomas too. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her voice. "Give us time. I will get you the money somehow, just do not hurt him." The scarred man considered this, then shrugged. "You got 3 days. But your brother stays with us until then, just to make sure you do not get any ideas about running to the marshal. Not that it would do any good. We ain't done nothing illegal, just collecting on a debt." Faith looked at Thomas one more time, willing him to say something, to fight back, to be the brother she remembered. But he just stared at the bar, shame radiating from him like heat. She turned and walked out of the saloon, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. The street was bright after the darkness inside, the sun beating down mercilessly. Faith stood there, trying to breathe, trying to think. $200 in 3 days. It was impossible. She could sell the land, but that would take weeks to arrange, and even then she would be signing away the last thing her parents had built. She could go to the bank, but she had no collateral, no husband to co-sign. She could ask the neighbors, but they had already made their position clear. She was alone in this. "Madam, are you all right?" Faith looked up to find Kade Brennan standing beside her, concern written across his weathered face. She had not even heard him approach. For a moment she just stared at him, this stranger who had shown her nothing but small courtesies, and something inside her broke open. "No," she said simply. "I am not all right at all." Kade glanced at the saloon, then back at her. "Can I walk you somewhere? You look like you could use some shade and water." Faith should have said no. She should have held onto her pride and her isolation. But she was so tired of carrying everything alone, so tired of pretending she was fine when she was drowning. So she nodded and let him guide her across the street to the small restaurant that served coffee and pie to the townspeople. They sat at a corner table, and the owner's wife, Mrs. Chen, brought them water without being asked. Faith drank deeply, her hands still shaking. Kade waited, patient, not pushing. Finally, Faith heard herself talking, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. She told him about the fire, about her parents, about Thomas and the debt, and the 3-day deadline. She told him about losing her faith, about feeling abandoned by God and fate, and every promise she had been taught to believe in. She told him things she had not told anyone, and he listened without judgment, his creek-water eyes steady on her face. When she finished, she felt emptied out, hollow as a gourd. "I am sorry," she said. "You did not need to hear all that." Kade was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My family had a ranch up in Colorado. Lost it 5 years ago to a banker who called in a loan early, during a drought when we could not possibly pay. My father tried to fight it, tried to argue that we just needed time. Bank sent men to enforce the eviction, and my father had a rifle. He was not going to shoot anybody, just trying to make a point, but one of the bank's men got nervous." He paused, his jaw tight. "My father died on the porch of the house he built with his own hands, and my mother followed him 6 months later from a broken heart. I have been drifting ever since, picking up work where I can, trying to figure out what comes next." Faith stared at him. "I am so sorry, I had no idea. No reason you would. I do not talk about it much." He leaned forward slightly. "But I am telling you now because I want you to know that I understand. I understand what it is like to lose everything, to feel like the world is unfair and God is not listening. And I understand what it is like to have to make impossible choices." "There is no choice to make," Faith said bitterly. "I have no way to get that kind of money." Kade was quiet again, thinking. Then he said, "What if there was a way?" Faith laughed, a harsh sound. "Unless you have $200 hidden in your saddlebag, I do not see how." "I have $40 saved up," Kade said slowly. "It is not much, but it is a start." Faith's eyes widened. "I cannot take your money, you do not even know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you are trying to save your brother. I know you have been dealt a raw hand and you are still fighting. That is enough for me." He paused. "But I have another idea too. There is a ranch about 20 miles from here, the Stockton place. They have been looking for hands to drive a herd up to the railhead in San Antonio. The pay is $50 per man, and they are leaving the day after tomorrow. If we can get on that drive and if I can get an advance on the pay, that would be $90. Still short, but closer." Faith repeated. "You can ride, can't you, ranch girl like you?" "Yes, but I have never driven cattle, and they are not going to hire a woman." Kade's mouth quirked in something almost like a smile. "Then we will make them see you are better than most men. Can you rope?" "Yes." "Shoot?" "Well enough." "Then we have a chance." He stood up, dropping coins on the table for the water. "Come on. We are going to the Stockton ranch, and you are going to show them what you can do." Faith sat there, stunned. This man, this stranger, was offering her not just money but hope, tangible action, a way forward when she had seen nothing but closed doors. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. Kade looked at her, and in his eyes she saw echoes of his own loss, his own long journey through grief. "Because somebody should have done it for me," he said simply. "And because it is the right thing to do." They rode out to the Stockton ranch that afternoon on borrowed horses, Faith in the split skirt and boots she had managed to salvage, her hat pulled low against the sun. The ranch was prosperous, with good buildings and strong fences, the kind of place her family's spread might have become if fate had been kinder. The foreman, a grizzled man named Patterson, looked skeptical when Kade explained what they wanted, and even more skeptical when he realized Faith was not just along for the ride. "I ain't never hired a woman for a drive," Patterson said flatly. "Then this is your chance to start," Kade said. "Give her a test. Let her show you what she can do. If she cannot keep up, we walk away, no hard feelings." Patterson considered this, then spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "All right. There is a 3-year-old steer in the far corral that needs roping and branding. You get him done. I will think about it." The corral was dusty and hot, and the steer was mean, a rangy beast with wild eyes and sharp horns. Faith felt the eyes of the ranch hands on her as she climbed onto the fence rail, felt their doubt and derision. She thought about her father teaching her to rope when she was 10 years old, his patient hands guiding hers, his voice steady and sure. She thought about her mother telling her that faith without works was dead, that you had to act on your beliefs. She thought about Thomas in that saloon, trapped by his mistakes, and about Kade Brennan offering her $40 and a chance. Then she dropped into the corral, her rope in her hand, and everything else fell away. The steer charged, and Faith sidestepped, reading his movements like words on a page. She let the rope fly, and it settled over his horns clean as a whistle. She dug in her heels and held him while the ranch hands moved in to flip and brand him, their movements efficient and practiced. When it was done, Patterson was nodding slowly. "I will be damned," he said. "All right, girl, you are on the drive. Same pay as the others, $50, and I will give you both a $20 advance right now. But I am warning you, it is hard work. Long days, rough nights, and we do not slow down for anybody." "I do not need you to slow down," Faith said, her heart hammering with relief and something else, something that felt almost like pride. They rode back to town with $40 in Kade's pocket and a plan taking shape. Kade would see if he could get a few days of advance work from the livery stable, maybe earn another $10 or $20. Faith would pawn her mother's locket, which might bring 15. It would still leave them short, but it was something. It was hope. That night, Faith lay in her narrow bed and realized she was not praying, but she was thinking about Grace, the unearned, undeserved kindness that Kade had shown her. She had been taught that grace came from God, a divine gift to unworthy sinners. But maybe grace also came from people, from the simple choice to help someone in need even when there was nothing in it for you. Maybe grace was Kade's $40 and his steady presence. Maybe grace was being seen and valued when you felt invisible. She thought about Kade's story, about his parents and his own loss. He had every reason to be bitter and closed off, to hoard his resources and look out only for himself. Instead, he had chosen kindness. Instead, he had chosen her. The cattle drive was set to leave at dawn on Friday, which gave them one more day to scrape together as much money as possible. Faith spent Thursday morning taking in every washing and mending job she could find, working until her fingers ached. Kade worked at the livery, mucking stalls and shoeing horses, and in the afternoon he won $12 in a shooting competition at the edge of town, his aim steady and true. By Thursday evening, they had $165. They were still $35 short, and time was running out. Faith sat on the boarding house porch, counting and recounting the money as if she could make more appear by sheer will. Kade sat beside her, his face thoughtful in the fading light. "We could ask the men holding Thomas to take what we have as a down payment," Faith said, but even as she said it, she knew it would not work. Men like that did not do favors or make deals. "There is one more option," Kade said slowly, "but you are not going to like it." Faith looked at him. "What?" "I have a pocket watch. It was my father's and his father's before that. Silver, engraved, worth maybe $40 to the right buyer. I have been carrying it for 5 years, figured I would keep it in memory of my family. But it is just a thing. Your brother is a person." Faith felt tears prick her eyes. "I cannot let you sell your father's watch. You have already given so much." "It is my choice," Kade said, "and I am choosing to do this. We sell the watch, we have enough. Simple as that." But it was not simple, and they both knew it. That watch was Kade's last tangible connection to the family he had lost, the same way her mother's locket had been hers. She had already pawned the locket, and the loss had felt like cutting off a piece of herself. She could not ask him to do the same. "There has to be another way," she said. Kade pulled the watch from his pocket and held it up, the silver catching the last rays of sunlight. It was beautiful, engraved with initials and a date. "My father would have done the same thing," he said quietly. "He always said that people mattered more than things. And you know what? He was right. This watch is not my father. My father is in here." He tapped his chest. "In the things he taught me, in the way I try to live, that is what matters." Faith looked at this man she had known for barely a week, this stranger who had somehow become the most important person in her rapidly shrinking world, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was not the breaking she had felt standing in the ashes of her home. It was something else, something warm and frightening and alive. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me," Kade said. "Just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you will not give up. Not on your brother, not on yourself, not on the possibility that things can get better. Because they can, Faith. I promise you they can." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They sat there as darkness fell over Bandera, two people who had lost everything finding something unexpected in each other. Friday morning came too soon and too slow all at once. Kade sold the watch at dawn to a jeweler who was just opening his shop, and the man counted out $42 in crisp bills. They added it to their pile and went to the saloon. The scarred man and his companion were there. Thomas slumped at a table between them, looking like he had not slept in days. When Faith walked in with Kade, both men straightened, their hands moving toward their guns. "We have your money," Faith said, keeping her voice steady. "All of it. Now let my brother go." The scarred man held out his hand and Kade counted out $200. The man counted it again, slowly, then nodded. "Pleasure doing business with you." He stood and his companion did the same. Thomas stayed where he was, staring at the table. "Thomas," Faith said. "Come on, we are leaving." But Thomas did not move. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice raw. "This is all my fault. Mom and Dad, the ranch, everything. I should have been there that night. If I had been home instead of in town gambling, maybe I could have." "Stop," Faith said, moving to kneel beside him. "You cannot think like that. The fire was not your fault. What happened to Mom and Dad was not your fault. But the debt was my fault, and I would have gotten you killed trying to fix my mistakes. But you did not. We got the money. You are safe now." Thomas finally looked at her and she saw tears tracking through the dirt on his face. "I do not deserve you. You are my brother. You do not have to deserve me. Now come on, let us get you cleaned up and fed. Then we are going to figure out what comes next together." They walked out of the saloon into the bright morning, Thomas leaning on Faith's shoulder, Kade walking close behind. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by exhaustion and the knowledge that they had just spent every penny they had. Faith still had the cattle drive, which would bring in $50 in a week or so, but that money would have to cover room and board for her and Thomas and start to rebuild some kind of life. The land was still there, but without money for lumber and livestock, it was just empty acres. They got Thomas settled in Faith's room at the boarding house with instructions to sleep, and then Faith and Kade rode out to join the cattle drive. Patterson was waiting with his crew, 20 men and 2,000 head of longhorns ready to move north toward San Antonio. The drive would take about 5 days if the weather held, following old trails through the Texas Hill Country. Faith had never done anything like this before, and the first day nearly broke her. The cattle were stubborn and unpredictable, the sun was merciless, and her horse was not used to the long hours. By the time they made camp that night, every muscle in her body was screaming. Kade helped her unsaddle her horse, his hands gentle when he showed her how to check for saddle sores and stone bruises. "First day is always the hardest," he said. "Tomorrow will be easier." "If I survive tomorrow," Faith muttered, lowering herself gingerly to the ground near the campfire. The other hands were eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She knew she had to prove herself, had to show them she could pull her weight. When the cook called for someone to help with the dishes, Faith volunteered, earning a grunt of approval from Patterson. When a steer broke from the herd in the middle of the night, Faith was one of the first to saddle up and help bring it back, despite her exhaustion. By the third day, the men had stopped treating her like a curiosity and started treating her like a hand. She earned their respect the hard way, through long hours and steady work, and when they made camp that night, one of the older cowboys nodded at her and said, "You will do." It was the best compliment she had ever received. Kade worked alongside her the whole way, never hovering or treating her like she needed protection, but always nearby if she needed help. They fell into an easy rhythm, anticipating each other's movements, working together like they had been doing this for years instead of days. At night, after the campfire died down and the other men rolled into their bedrolls, Kade and Faith would sit together and talk in low voices about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother's garden and her father's stories. He told her about Colorado, about the mountains and the way the aspen trees turned gold in autumn. "You ever think about going back?" Faith asked. Kade shook his head. "Nothing there for me anymore. The land is gone, the house is gone, it would just be ghosts. But do you miss it?" "Every day. But missing something and going back to it are different things. Some doors close for good, and you have to find new ones to open." Faith thought about her own burned ranch, about the life she had lost. "I used to think I knew exactly what my future looked like. I would marry someone from a neighboring ranch, have children, grow old in the house where I was born. Now I do not know anything anymore." "Maybe that is not such a bad thing," Kade said. "Maybe not knowing means you get to decide. You get to choose what comes next instead of just following the path that was laid out for you." It was a radical thought, one that would have seemed like heresy to the Faith who existed before the fire. But this Faith, the one sitting by a campfire in the middle of nowhere with dirt under her nails and aching muscles, found the idea strangely liberating. Maybe she did not have to rebuild her old life. Maybe she could build something entirely new. On the fourth night, a storm rolled in from the west, great towering clouds that turned the sky purple and green. The cattle grew nervous, and Patterson ordered everyone to saddle up and spread out around the herd to prevent a stampede. Faith took up position on the south side, her horse dancing beneath her as thunder rumbled and lightning split the sky. The first raindrops were heavy and cold, and within minutes it was a full downpour, the kind of storm that turned the world into sheets of water. The cattle began to move, a ripple of nervousness spreading through the herd like a wave. Faith could feel her horse's fear, could feel her own heart hammering in her chest. Then lightning struck a tree not 50 yards away, and the cattle broke. 2,000 head of longhorns running in blind panic was like nothing Faith had ever experienced. The ground shook with their hooves, their bellowing filled the air, and the darkness was absolute except for the flickering lightning. Faith spurred her horse forward, riding alongside the stampede, trying to turn the leaders, trying to get them to curve back on themselves. She could hear other riders shouting, could see shapes in the darkness, but mostly she focused on staying in the saddle and not getting trampled. She did not know how long it lasted, minutes or hours. Time lost meaning in the chaos. But slowly, gradually, the herd began to slow, the leaders tiring, the panic burning itself out. By the time the storm passed and gray dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the cattle were scattered across several miles of hill country, but they were no longer running. The hands began the tedious process of gathering them up again, counting heads, checking for injuries. Faith found Kade near the remnants of their camp, his hat gone and his shirt torn. "You all right?" he asked, reaching up to help her dismount. "I think so." Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground and Kade caught her, his arms strong and steady around her. "You did real good out there," he said. "I saw you turning the leaders. That probably saved half the herd." Faith became suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of his arms still around her, of the way his eyes looked in the early morning light. Something passed between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement of what had been building all week. Kade's hand came up to brush a wet strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "Faith," he said, her name soft in his mouth. She did not know who moved first, but then his lips were on hers, and she was kissing him back, her hands fisting in his wet shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss was everything she had not known. She needed warmth and connection, and the promise of something beyond mere survival. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kade rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that for days," he admitted. "Me too," Faith whispered, surprising herself with the truth of it. They might have said more, but Patterson was calling for all hands to help with the gather, and they had to break apart and get back to work. But everything felt different now, charged with new meaning. Every time their eyes met across the herd, Faith felt that warmth bloom in her chest again. Every time Kade rode close enough to speak to her, she found herself smiling. They reached the railhead outside San Antonio on the afternoon of the 5th day, the cattle dusty and thin, but mostly intact. Patterson paid out the wages with grudging approval, handing Faith her $50 with a nod. "You ever need work again, you come find me. You have got grit." The ride back to Bandera took most of a day, and Faith and Kade used the time to talk about what came next. Faith's immediate concern was Thomas, making sure he was all right, figuring out how to move forward. But beneath that was the larger question of what she was going to do with her life, with the land, with the future that stretched out uncertain before her. "You could sell the land," Kade suggested. "Take the money and start fresh somewhere else." "I have thought about it," Faith admitted. "But that land is all I have left of my family. It feels wrong to just give it up." "Then do not give it up. Rebuild." "With what money? $50 will not even buy enough lumber for a decent cabin, let alone a barn and fences and livestock." Kade was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if you had a partner? Someone to share the work and the costs. Faith's heart skipped. What are you saying? I am saying I have been drifting for 5 years and I am tired of it. I am saying I have $50 too and a strong back and a lot of experience with ranching. I am saying that maybe we could build something together, if you wanted to. Faith looked at him, at this man who had given her so much, who had shown her that grace existed in the world through simple acts of kindness. She thought about the kiss in the rain, about the way she felt when he was near, about the possibility of a future that was not lonely and bitter. I want to, she said. I want that very much. They reached Bandera at dusk, tired and dusty and happy. Thomas was waiting at the boarding house, looking better than he had in weeks, clean, fed, and sober. When Faith told him about the plan to rebuild the ranch, his eyes lit up with something that looked like hope. Can I help? He asked. I know I messed up. I know I let you down, but I want to make it right. I want to help build it back. Faith looked at her brother, at the boy who had made terrible mistakes but was still her family, and felt something hard inside her finally soften. Yes, she said. We do it together. The three of them sat up late that night making plans, sketching out ideas for a modest cabin, figuring out how to stretch their combined $100 to cover basic supplies. It would not be easy. They would have to do most of the work themselves, would have to live rough for months while they built. But it was possible. It was a start. Over the next weeks, Faith discovered that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. She swung a hammer until her hands blistered and then kept swinging. She hauled timber and mixed mortar and learned how to notch logs for tight joints. Kade worked beside her from dawn until dark, his shirt off in the heat, his muscles corded from hard labor. Thomas threw himself into the work with almost desperate energy, as if he could atone for his mistakes through sheer physical effort. Slowly, impossibly, a cabin began to take shape on the hill above Cypress Creek where the old house had stood. It was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was solid and well built. The neighbors came by to watch their progress, and some of them brought gifts, a bag of nails here, some spare hinges there. Mrs. Chen from the restaurant showed up one day with a crate of preserves and a quilt she said she had been meaning to donate somewhere. Even Patterson from the cattle drive rode out to see how they were doing, and he brought a young steer and a heifer as payment for the good work Faith had done. Figured you could use some breeding stock, he said, then rode off before Faith could properly thank him. She stood there holding the lead ropes, tears running down her face as the reality of what was happening finally hit her. She was not alone. She had been so certain that she had lost everything, that God had abandoned her, that the world was a cold and indifferent place. But here was evidence to the contrary. Here were people showing up, helping, caring. Here was grace in action. That night, she and Kade sat on the half-finished porch of the new cabin, watching the stars come out over the hill country. Thomas had gone into town to pick up supplies, leaving them alone for the first time in days. I have been thinking, Faith said slowly, about what you said before. About grace coming from people, not just from God. Kade looked at her, waiting. I think you were right, she continued. I think grace is everywhere if you know how to look for it. It is in the neighbors who bring nails even though they wanted to buy my land cheap. It is in Patterson bringing cattle. It is in Mrs. Chen's quilt. And it is in you, in everything you have done for me and Thomas. She paused, gathering her courage. I lost my faith in God, but I think maybe I found faith in something else, in people, in kindness. In the possibility that good things can still happen even after terrible ones. Kade took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I think that is what faith is supposed to be, he said. Not just believing in a distant God, but believing in the goodness of the people around you. Believing that you can survive hard things and come out the other side. believing that tomorrow might be better than today. Faith leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said, the words surprising her even as they left her mouth. But they were true, she realized. Somewhere in the last few weeks, between the cattle drive and the cabin building, between the small kindnesses and the large sacrifices, she had fallen completely in love with Kade Brennan. She felt him go still, then his arm came around her, pulling her close. "I love you too," he said. "I have loved you since you roped that steer at Patterson's ranch with fire in your eyes, since you sat on that boarding house porch counting money you did not have and refused to give up, since you rode through that stampede like you were born to it." He turned to face her, his hands gentle on her face. "Faith Owens, will you marry me? Will you build this life with me, not just as partners but as husband and wife?" Faith felt joy flood through her, bright and unexpected and entirely wonderful. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church Faith had stopped attending. The minister who performed the service was the same one who had presided over her parents' funeral, and Faith had not spoken to him since. But when she walked into the church on Thomas's arm, wearing a simple blue dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her make, she felt something shift. She still did not have easy answers about God or providence or why bad things happen to good people. But she had learned that faith was not about having all the answers. It was about showing up anyway, about choosing hope and kindness even when the world felt cruel. Kade stood at the altar in a new shirt bought special for the occasion, his eyes bright as she walked toward him. The church was full neighbors and townspeople, Patterson and some of his crew, Mrs. Garrett from the boarding house, even the marshal. All these people who had been there in small ways, offering grace when she needed it most. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, Thomas stood up. Faith's heart nearly stopped, but then her brother said, "I just want to say something. My sister saved my life in more ways than one. And Kade, you gave up everything to help us when you did not have to. I want you both to know that I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure I am worthy of that sacrifice. I am going to be the brother and the man you both deserve." Faith was crying by the time Thomas sat down, and when she looked at Kade, his eyes were wet too. They spoke their vows with shaking voices, promising to love and honor each other through whatever came, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the whole church erupted in applause. The reception was held at the ranch, such as it was. Someone brought a fiddle, someone else brought a guitar, and they danced on the bare ground in front of the half-finished cabin as the sun set in ribbons of gold and orange. Faith danced with Kade, with Thomas, with Patterson, with neighbors she had known all her life and some she had just met. She danced until her feet hurt and her face ached from smiling, and when she finally collapsed beside Kade on the porch steps, she felt like her heart might burst from happiness. "How did we get here?" she asked, half laughing. "2 months ago I was standing in ashes with nothing. Now look at us." Kade kissed her temple. "We got here because you refused to give up, because you are stronger than you know, and because you let me help you." "Best decision I ever made," Faith said, turning to kiss him properly. They spent their wedding night in the little cabin, the windows open to let in the cool November air, and Faith felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. In Kade's arms, in this place she was rebuilding, in this new life she was creating. The months that followed were hard but good. Winter came to the hill country, bringing cold rains and occasional ice storms. The three of them worked through it, finishing the cabin and starting on a barn. Faith discovered she was pregnant in February, and the joy of it nearly overwhelmed her. She had thought she would never have a husband, a child, a home. She had thought all her chances for happiness died in that fire. But here she was, belly growing round with new life, working alongside Kade and Thomas to build fences and plant a kitchen garden. The 2 cattle Patterson had given them multiplied, and they were able to buy 3 more with the money Faith earned doing occasional sewing work in town. It was not much, not yet, but it was theirs, built from nothing with their own hands and stubborn determination. Faith thought often about Grace in those months. She thought about how it had come to her in unexpected forms, not as divine intervention or miraculous rescue, but as simple human kindness. Kade offering his money and his time, Patterson giving her a chance and then cattle, the neighbors bringing supplies, Thomas choosing to change, to fight his demons and become someone better. These were the small acts that had saved her, that had rebuilt her life from ashes. And she thought about Faith, too. Not the unquestioning certainty she had been taught as a child, but something deeper and more complicated. Faith as trust in the people around you. Faith as hope that tomorrow could be better. Faith as the choice to keep going even when everything seemed lost. She still did not go to church regularly, still struggled with the big theological questions. But she prayed sometimes in her own way, and she felt something like gratitude for the second chance she had been given. The baby came in late September, a boy with his father's creek water eyes and a cry that could wake the dead. They named him Daniel, after Kade's father, and Thomas carved a cradle from cedar wood that smelled like the hill country summer. Faith had never known love like this, fierce and protective and all-consuming. She held her son and thought about her own parents, about how they had built a life and raised a family on this land. She was doing the same now, continuing their legacy in a way she had never expected. Kade was a natural father, patient and gentle, singing old songs to Daniel in the middle of the night when the baby fussed. Thomas was a devoted uncle, taking turns walking the floor when Daniel would not sleep, making silly faces to earn toothless grins. Watching them together, Faith felt her heart expand to hold all this love, all this unexpected joy. The ranch grew slowly over the next few years. They bought more cattle, built better fences, added a room onto the cabin for Thomas. Faith learned that she had a knack for training horses, and word got around. People started bringing her difficult animals to work with, paying decent money for her time. Kade took on occasional work as a ranch hand when they needed extra cash, and Thomas proved to be an excellent cattleman, with an instinct for breeding and herd management that rivaled their father's. When Daniel was 3, Faith became pregnant again. This time it was a girl, and they named her Grace. It seemed fitting, given everything they had been through. Kade Brennan came into the world during a spring thunderstorm, her first cries mingling with the sound of rain on the roof. She had Faith's dark hair and a determined expression that promised she would be a force to be reckoned with. Thomas married a schoolteacher from San Antonio when Daniel was 5. A smart, kind woman named Elizabeth who fit into their family like she had always been there. They built a house on the eastern edge of the property, close enough to help with the ranch but far enough for privacy. Elizabeth helped Faith with the children and taught them their letters, and in return, Faith taught her how to ride and rope. The 2 women became close friends, sisters in all but blood. The ranch prospered. It would never be the large operation Faith's parents had built, but it was solid and sustainable, enough to support 2 families comfortably. They called it the Double B, for Brennan and Bandera, and the brand was a simple design of 2 interlocking letters. Patterson came by once a year to see how they were doing and always left impressed by their progress. He offered Kade a foreman position more than once, but Kade always declined. He was where he wanted to be, Faith was 30 years old when she finally went back to church. It was a Sunday morning, unseasonably cool for July, and something inside her said it was time. Kade went with her, Daniel and Grace between them, Thomas and Elizabeth following behind. They sat in the back row, and Faith listened to the sermon with different ears than she had 10 years before. The minister talked about grace and redemption, about how God worked through people, how the divine showed up in everyday kindness and simple acts of love. Afterward, the minister stopped them on the steps. "It is good to see you back, Faith. We have missed you." "I miss this too," Faith said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I just needed time to figure some things out." "And did you?" Faith looked at Kade, at her children, at the family she had built from nothing. "Yes," she said. "I think I did. I learned that faith is not about having all the answers. It is about trusting that you can survive whatever comes. And I learned that grace is not just something that comes from above. It is something we give each other every day in 1,000 small ways." The minister smiled. "That is the best sermon I have heard all week." They started going to church regularly after that, not out of obligation, but because Faith found comfort in the community, in the shared rituals, in the songs she had learned as a child. Her faith looked different now than it had before the fire. It was more complicated, more nuanced, more focused on action than on doctrine. But it was also deeper and more real, rooted in lived experience rather than abstract belief. Time moved on the way it does, in a blur of seasons and milestones. Daniel grew tall and serious, with his father's steady nature and his mother's determination. Grace grew wild and fearless, climbing trees and racing horses, and giving her parents constant heart attacks. Thomas and Elizabeth had 3 children of their own, and the ranch echoed with the sounds of cousins playing, of family dinners that stretched long into the evening, of laughter and love and life. Faith was 42 when Thomas came to her with news that made her heart stop. He had found her mother's old recipe book in the ruins of the original ranch house, buried under debris but miraculously intact. The pages were yellowed and smoke-stained, but the handwriting was still legible, her mother's careful script preserved against all odds. Faith cried when she held it, turning the pages with shaking hands, reading notes in the margins that her mother had written decades ago. Here was proof that not everything had been lost in the fire, that some things survived even the worst disasters. She copied out the recipes and gave them to Elizabeth, to Grace, to the daughters-in-law who would come later. She wanted these traditions to continue, wanted her mother's legacy to live on in the meals they cooked and the stories they told. Kade was 50 when his hair started going gray at the temples, and Faith thought he had never looked more handsome. They had been married 22 years, and she loved him more than she had on that day in the little church. He was still the man who had offered her his last $40, who had sold his father's watch to save her brother, who had chosen kindness when the world offered coldness. But he was also the man who had held her hand through 2 difficult births, who had built her a life with his own hands, who still kissed her every morning like she was precious. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the land they had rebuilt, when Kade said, "Do you ever regret it? Staying here, rebuilding? We could have gone anywhere, started fresh." Faith considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if we had made different choices. But regret? No, never. This place, this life, you and the kids, this is everything I ever wanted, even if I did not know it until I almost lost it all." "I love you," Kade said, pulling her close. "Thank you for letting me build this with you. Thank you for showing me grace when I needed it most," Faith replied. "Thank you for teaching me that faith is not about believing the right things. It is about choosing hope, choosing kindness, choosing love even when everything seems lost. Daniel married at 24, bringing home a rancher's daughter from Careville who knew cattle and loved the land as much as he did. Grace shocked everyone by becoming a teacher, riding circuit between the small towns in the hill country, bringing education to children who had no schools nearby. Thomas and Elizabeth's children grew and married and had children of their own, and the ranch expanded to accommodate the growing family. Faith and Kade became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their legacy multiply and spread. They taught the grandchildren the same lessons they had learned the hard way, that life could be cruel, but people could be kind. That loss was inevitable, but so was renewal. That grace showed up in unexpected places if you kept your eyes open. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch. There were more than 60 people, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, nephews and nieces and cousins. The sprawling, boisterous family that had grown from the ashes of that terrible fire so long ago. They ate and danced and told stories, and when someone asked Faith to say a few words, she stood with Kade's hand in hers and looked out at all these people, all this love. 50 years ago, she said, her voice still strong despite her 72 years, I thought my life was over. I had lost everything, and I saw no way forward. But then, a cowboy I barely knew offered me grace in the form of simple kindness, and that changed everything. He showed me that faith is not about having all the answers or believing the right things. Faith is about trusting that tomorrow can be better than today. It is about choosing to help someone even when you have nothing to gain. It is about building something beautiful from the wreckage of what was lost. She squeezed Kade's hand. I learned that grace comes from God, yes, but it also comes from us, from the choices we make every day to be kind, to be generous, to show up for each other. And I learned that love is the most powerful force in the universe, stronger than fire or loss or despair. Love is what saves us. Love is what endures. There was not a dry eye in the crowd, and when Faith sat down, her children and grandchildren surrounded her, hugging her, thanking her for the life she had built, for the lessons she had taught, for the love she had given so freely. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Faith and Kade sat on the porch of the big house that had replaced the little cabin years ago. The stars were bright overhead, and the sounds of the ranch cattle lowing, horses moving in the pasture, a coyote calling in the distance were as familiar as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" Kade asked, his arm around her shoulders. "About that day in town when you asked if you could walk me somewhere," Faith said. "About how close I came to saying no, to keeping all my pride and my pain locked inside. What if I had? What if I had not let you help me? But you did," Kade said, "and that took more courage than you know." Accepting help, accepting grace, is one of the hardest things a person can do. "You made it easy," Faith said. "You made me feel seen and valued when I felt invisible. You showed me that I was worth saving." "You were always worth saving," Kade said. "You just needed someone to remind you." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that came from 50 years of knowing each other, of building a life together, of weathering storms and celebrating joys. Faith thought about all the years stretching behind them, about the children they had raised and the land they had nurtured. She thought about the girl she had been at 22, standing in ashes and believing the world had ended. That girl could never have imagined this full, rich, complicated life. This love that had only deepened with time. This family that had grown from two broken people choosing to build something together. This faith that had been shaken to its core and then rebuilt into something stronger, more resilient, more real. "I would do it all again," Faith said suddenly. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every loss." I would do it all again to end up right here with you, with this life we have built. Kade kissed her forehead. Me too, love, me too. They were 75 and 77 when Kade's health began to fail. It was his heart, the doctor said, worn out from years of hard work and good living. He had maybe a year, maybe less. Faith refused to accept it at first, but Kade took the news with his characteristic calm. We have had 53 years, he reminded her. That is more than most people get. That is a blessing. But Faith was not ready to say goodbye. She clung to him, memorizing every detail, the way his hands looked folded over his chest, the sound of his breathing in the night, the weight of his body next to hers in bed. The family rallied around them, children and grandchildren visiting constantly, telling Kade how much he meant to them, how much he had shaped their lives. Daniel, now 51 and running the ranch, sat with his father and said, "Everything I know about being a good man I learned from you." Grace, at 48 and still teaching, held her father's hand and said, "You taught me that kindness is strength, not weakness. That has made all the difference in my life." Thomas, now 73 himself, told Kade, "You saved my life, you and Faith both. I never forgot that, and I never will." Kade lived for 14 more months, each day a gift. Faith cared for him with tenderness and determination, refusing to let him see her cry. She told him stories about their life together, reminded him of all the good things they had seen and done. She thanked him every day for choosing her, for showing her grace, for loving her so completely. On a warm May morning, with Faith lying beside him and sunlight streaming through the window, Kade Brennan took his last breath. Faith held him and felt her heart break all over again, the same way it had broken when she lost her parents. But this time, she was not alone in her grief. Her children were there, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, Thomas and Elizabeth. The whole sprawling family that she and Kade had created together. They buried him on the hill overlooking Cypress Creek, in sight of the cabin where they had started their life together. The funeral was huge. 3 generations of family and friends from across the hill country coming to pay their respects to a man who had lived with integrity and kindness. The minister spoke about grace and faith, about how Kade had embodied both in his quiet, steady way. Faith stood at the graveside and felt the weight of loss pressing down on her, but she also felt something else: gratitude. Gratitude for every year, every day, every moment they had shared. Gratitude that she had said yes when he offered help, that she had opened her heart when she wanted to close it, that she had chosen love over bitterness. She lived 3 more years without him, surrounded by family, still strong and clear-minded until the end. She spent her time teaching the great-grandchildren to rope, telling stories about Kade and her parents and the early days of the ranch. She wrote everything down in journals, wanting to preserve the history, the lessons, the love. On her last day, at 78 years old, Faith Brennan sat on the porch of the big house and looked out over the land she and Kade had rebuilt from ashes. It was prosperous now, thriving, home to 4 generations of family. Everything she and Kade had dreamed of and more. Grace sat with her, holding her hand. "Are you comfortable, Mama? Do you need anything?" Faith smiled at her daughter. "I have everything I need, sweetheart. I have had a good life, a blessed life. I lost everything once, but I gained so much more. Your father showed me that grace exists in simple kindness, and that faith is about choosing hope even in the darkest times. And he loved me with his whole heart for 53 years. What more could anyone ask for?" That night, Faith Owens Brennan passed peacefully in her sleep, and when they found her in the morning, she had a smile on her face. They buried her next to Kade on the hill, their graves side by side the way their lives had been, and the whole family came to say goodbye. Daniel stood to speak at the funeral, his voice thick with emotion. My mother taught us that faith is not about never doubting. It is about choosing to believe anyway, choosing to hope anyway, choosing to love anyway. She lost everything at 22, and instead of becoming bitter, she became better. She built a life of love and grace from ashes and heartbreak, and she did it with our Father, who showed her kindness when she needed it most and loved her until his last breath. He looked out at the crowd, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the family that had grown from two people who refused to give up. This is their legacy. Not just the ranch, not just the land, but the lessons they taught us about resilience and faith and love. About showing grace to others, especially when they are at their lowest. About choosing kindness over bitterness, hope over despair, love over everything. Years later, the ranch was still in the family, now run by Daniel's son with help from Grace's daughter. The big house was full of life and laughter, and the graves on the hill were tended carefully, surrounded by wildflowers that bloomed every spring. The story of Faith and Kade became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, a reminder of where they came from and what they stood for. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set in ribbons of gold over the Texas hill country, the descendants of Faith and Kade would sit on the porch of that big house and feel something like grace settling over them, the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves, part of a story of love and resilience that had started in ashes and grown into something beautiful and enduring. They were the living proof that faith could be shaken and rebuilt into something stronger. That grace existed in simple acts of kindness between people who chose to help each other. That love, real love, could survive anything, loss and grief and time itself, and leave a legacy that echoed down through generations. Faith Owens had lost everything at 22. And a cowboy named Kade Brennan had showed her grace through simple kindness. From that one act of compassion, from that choice to help a stranger in need, had grown a love story for the ages and a family that would carry their values forward for generations to come. It was a testament to the power of choosing hope, choosing kindness, choosing love even when the world seemed dark and empty. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy of all.